The first true year of the San Antonio Spurs rebuild went about as expected. There were some high points and there were some lows, with a great start to the season and of course a very frustrating losing streak, but ultimately the focus was on player development and trying to get the number one overall pick. They did a very good job on both fronts, but let's discuss that player development and what could be in store for their offseason. With the departure of Dejounte Murray and with Keldon Johnson having his new extension in hand, it was on him to rise to the occasion for the Spurs this season. Whilst his efficiency did fall, specifically from three, it certainly wasn't all bad for Keldon Johnson as the number one option this season. He was still a league average three-point shooter, again, all whilst being a number one option for the first time on one of the worst offenses in the league, and with relatively poor spacing for the majority of the season. Keldon Johnson was in the bottom 12% of the league in openness rating on three-point shots this season, and when you throw in a month of 15.8% shooting from three, it puts his numbers in context, and it makes them not look as outrageously poor as they would otherwise. Throughout the month of March, he shot over 44% from three. He could still shoot. He just had some rough patches this year, and again, was the number one option on an offense where he had to do a lot, and spacing did lack. Now, surely he's not going to be the number one option on this team when the Spurs are winning. He's not the number one option on any winning team, but he did improve throughout the season. He's certainly not going to be anywhere near an elite shot creator, but he improved throughout the season as a mid-range jump shooter, improved his floater game. He's still a good three-point shooter and a good slasher, and once he gets to fill back into being a second option or a third option, his success and efficiency on the offensive end will rise. Devin Vassell was set for the typical year 3 San Antonio Spurs jump, as so many young guys do in San Antonio, and despite the fact that he struggled to regularly stay in the lineup, struggling with injuries at different parts in the season, the year 3 jump is certainly what he had. He had career highs in points, assists, free throw attempts, and efficiency, most importantly, whilst moving into a role as the second option on the Spurs team behind Keldon Johnson, and arguably was the first option on some nights. Devin Vassell improved as a shot creator in year 3, shot around league average on pull-up threes, and that combined with his elite catch-and-shoot three-point shooting ability and solid defense, it's going to lead to him being a high upside player moving forward as a key secondary piece of this Spurs roster. Again, likely not the number one guy, but this is the start of the Spurs rebuild, and they're just going to start drafting high in the lottery. These guys are going to be valuable complementary pieces. Malachi Branham has showed flashes throughout his rookie season, which for a Spurs rookie selected outside of the lottery is great to see. Those guys typically don't get minutes regardless of the team environment. His athleticism and shot creation ability has upside moving into next season and could be a valuable scoring piece off of the bench moving forward. Jeremy Sochan entered the league as a great athlete with elite defensive upside. The question was simply going to be how much he would develop on the offensive end. Now, I loved the tape on him coming into the league. Now, I love defense. I have a defense-heavy bias. A good long defensive wing is always going to be a valuable piece in the NBA. But already he has shown tremendous improvements on the offensive end. And the fact that he's been able to improve so much already makes you really hopeful as a neutral and as a Spurs fan for how much he could potentially improve moving forward. He's gone from shooting 40% from the free throw line in his first month in the league to shooting over 75% over the last 3 months, and has already scored a 30-point game. There's going to be a ton of upside for him on the offensive end, and looks like a great draft selection from the Spurs this season. Blake Wesley was the third of the Spurs' 2022 first-round selections, and in turn was the third most productive. There's still plenty of time for Wesley to improve as he enters year 3 at age 22, but his rookie season certainly left a lot to be desired. Zach Collins finally stayed healthy for the majority of a season and showed that he has a very important place in the NBA. Collins produced a career high in points, rebounds, assists, and efficiency, and has since been named the starting center for the Spurs next season by Coach Pop. Tre Jones replaced Dejounte Murray as the starting point guard this season, and he more than held his own. His efficiency from the field fell, but he improved significantly as a three-point shooter, although it was still well below league average. But he has certainly continued to show that he can attack the rim well, can play make for others, and can commit very minimal turnovers while doing so. Similarly to his brother Tyus in Memphis, he's likely going to be best as a backup point guard, but certainly fills in the role well for the Spurs for the time being. Tre Jones will be one of the main discussions of the Spurs 2022-23 offseason. With Keldon Johnson already extended, Tre Jones becomes the only former Spurs draft pick out of contract this summer. Although he may not be the starting point guard of the future, he could certainly be a solid rotational guard, and I would personally expect the Spurs to re-sign him on a multi-year deal, likely in the range of $10 to $12 million. I would not be surprised to see Tre Jones assume the former Corey Joseph role over the next few years. Romeo Langford enters the 2023 offseason as a restricted free agent, of course being the former Boston Celtics selection. The 23-year-old shooting guard had arguably the best season of his career with the Spurs, but it still left a lot to be desired as someone who is proving his future on his next contract in the NBA. He certainly doesn't appear to be a core piece of the Spurs' future, and I would not be surprised to see him walk this offseason. Gorgui Dieng is another impending free agent, and given his very poor play this season, I would personally be very, very surprised if he is a member of the Spurs next season. Keita Bates-Diop is the other notable remaining free agent for the Spurs this offseason, and that's considering the fact that he is coming off of a career year. With that in mind, I would not be surprised at all for the Spurs to bring him back on a multi-year deal. The Spurs are still lacking wing depth, although the draft could change that, and Keita Bates-Diop is a solid vet with a greatly improved three-point shooter and a solid defender, something the Spurs are going to continue to need, whether they get Victor or whether they don't. With regards to any trades this upcoming offseason, the Spurs are still in a rebuild and are just a year removed from trading away their star to kickstart the process, that being in trading away Dejounte Murray. So I don't expect any big stars on the way in, nor do I expect someone like Devin Vassell or Keldon Johnson to be moved. That being said, the Spurs could look to move off some veterans this offseason, which we will discuss briefly. As far as free agency signings they'll bring in, they might bring in a couple of vets like a Doug McDermott again. But there's not going to be anything significant from San Antonio because the Spurs typically aren't a big free agency destination, nevertheless during a rebuild. Some of these veterans that could be traded away or moved off of this offseason include Khem Birch, who has yet to play a game for the Spurs since being traded there at the deadline largely due to injury, and he's struggled to stay healthy in general over the last couple of years. He hasn't been great when he has been healthy, and given he only has 1 year left on his contract, it seems likely he will be traded or bought out by the Spurs this offseason. Doug McDermott is another veteran who enters the last year of his deal in his 2023-24 season, and Doug's had a solid year with the Spurs. He continues to be a solid three-point shooter and a good veteran presence, but the Spurs may elect to keep another wing and veteran on the roster. They could move off him this offseason, or they could wait until the trade deadline and get some future assets for him at that point in time. But it's certainly clear that Doug McDermott's not going to be a core part of the Spurs' future, and they would be wise to get some future assets back for him. The same could be said for Devonte Graham, who was acquired in the Josh Richardson trade at the deadline. He has 2 years left on his deal, but the last year is mainly non-guaranteed, meaning that Devonte Graham is more or less entering the last year of his contract. He continues to be a highly inefficient scoring guard. He likely does not fit into the long-term plans of the San Antonio Spurs, but if they could get some future value back for him, it's probably worthwhile. The most important part of the Spurs offseason, just like it was last year, will be the draft. The Spurs enter the 2023 NBA draft with their own first-round pick, which will be one of the best picks in the draft, regardless of how the lottery goes, although, of course, you're hoping for Victor. They will also possess their own second-round pick, which will be pick 32, and they will also have the Toronto Raptors second-round pick, which at the very least will likely be in the top half of the second round. The Spurs already have great complementary pieces in Keldon Johnson and Devin Vassell, but if they can acquire their future superstar with their own first-round selection this year, that would propel the Spurs rebuild very, very far forward. The upcoming season is likely going to be more of what we just saw in the 2022-23 season for the San Antonio Spurs. They're only entering year 2 of their rebuild, that being the second year since they fully got rid of their high-end talent, that being when they traded away Dejounte Murray. And so another season of player development is going to be incoming. There's likely not going to be any shot at making the play-in tournament with as competitive as the Western Conference is. But there is the hope that some ping pong balls can bounce the right way and the Spurs can select Victor Wembanyama.